The chamber was already tense, but when Justice Barrett leaned forward, her voice cracked like a whip through the silence. "Tell me, Representative Crockett, how do you justify speaking for the Constitution when you barely seem to understand it?" The words weren't just sharp. They were designed to wound. Reporters froze mid-scribble. Cameras zoomed in, and the entire room tilted into stillness, as though history itself had pressed pause. Crockett didn't flinch. Seated at the witness table, she clasped her hands together, her gaze steady, her breath measured. No blink, no twitch, no sign of the storm raging around her. The attack wasn't just a legal jab. It was personal, laced with dismissal, dripping with superiority. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Even seasoned clerks shifted uneasily in their seats. In the gallery, the word spread like wildfire. Phones lit up with notifications. Headlines began to form before the exchange had even ended. Supreme Court showdown live. Barrett strikes at Crockett. Congress versus court. Clash of eras. It wasn't supposed to go this way. Barrett's words carried the weight of a justice cloaked in authority. Her tone calibrated to humiliate, to draw blood before the cameras. She expected Crockett to stumble, to lash back, to crumble under the weight of centuries of condescension. But Crockett's silence was louder than any outburst. She leaned ever so slightly forward, as if waiting, not cornered but calculating. The chamber had seen arguments before, heated exchanges, political theater played for the cameras. But this felt different. This was the Supreme Court, the so-called pinnacle of American decorum, suddenly reduced to a spectacle. And at its center stood a woman targeted not just for her words, but for what she represented. Youth progress, defiance against the old order. A clerk shifted in the corner. A journalist whispered, "Did she really just say that?" Somewhere in the back, someone's pen clattered to the floor. The silence was unbearable, heavy, stretching long enough for the world outside to feel it. Every eye in that chamber locked on Crockett. Would she fire back? Would she stumble? Or would she, unthinkably, turn the entire moment against the very justice who had sought to diminish her? But no one in that chamber expected what happened next. The confrontation was never just about one question, one courtroom, or one exchange between two powerful women. It was about what each of them represented, and why this single clash carried the weight of something far bigger than themselves. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the conservative cornerstone of the court, had long been cast as untouchable. Her words carried the gravitas of finality. Her robe draped not only in authority, but in the cultural weight of a movement that believed her presence secured decades of conservative dominance. To many, she was the immovable force, unquestionable, unassailable, shielded by the marble walls of the court itself. When Barrett spoke, people were trained to listen, to accept, to bow. Across from her sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had built her reputation not by playing safe, but by speaking sharp truths that others feared to voice. Crockett had walked into this chamber not as a guest, but as a storm, calm in demeanor, fearless in essence. To her supporters, she was proof that voices too often marginalized, black voices, women's voices, working-class voices, could stand in halls of power and not only be heard but command attention. So when Barrett raised her voice and cut at Crockett with surgical cruelty, the moment stopped being an ordinary exchange. It became symbolic. The old guard striking down the new, privilege versus perseverance, tradition versus transformation. Women across the country who had ever been talked over, cut down, or dismissed could feel the sting in Barrett's words. And in Crockett's silence, they saw something else: restraint, discipline, the simmering power of refusing to be baited. The stakes stretched beyond gender and into the Constitution itself. Barrett invoked the law as a weapon, as if to say, "You do not belong in this conversation. This is my domain." But Crockett, trained in the language of both law and lived experience, had spent her career reminding America that the Constitution was not written to be guarded by a select few. It was written to be claimed, challenged, and interpreted by the people. And now, she had the chance to prove it. Political observers watching from home felt it instantly. This was not just another partisan squabble. It was a tectonic confrontation, the embodiment of two visions of America colliding in real time. Barrett, cloaked in the aura of authority, striking from above, Crockett, grounded in community and conviction, staring straight ahead. The whisper spread quickly through media circles. If Crockett answered this blow with force, this clip wouldn't just trend. It would live forever. Reporters exchanged glances. Editors scrambled to prepare headlines. On Twitter, drafts of breaking news posts hovered, waiting for the next word. Somewhere, a producer mouthed what many were already thinking. This could be the most replayed clip in Supreme Court history, because deep down, everyone in that chamber and everyone watching from a screen knew what was about to unfold wasn't procedural. It was personal, symbolic, unforgettable. It wasn't simply Barrett versus Crockett. It was every silenced voice versus the gatekeepers of silence. It was a question of who gets to define America and who refuses to be defined. The tension was no longer whether Crockett would respond. The question had become how she would respond, and how her response would echo across a nation hungry for proof that dignity could stand toe-to-toe with power and not flinch. And as Crockett leaned forward, lips parted to speak, the room braced itself. Somewhere between the gasp of anticipation and the pounding silence, history was already shifting. To understand the shock of this clash, you have to understand who Justice Amy Coney Barrett has been built up to be, not just by the court, not just by her conservative allies, but by the very system that has guarded her ascent. Her name alone conjures a story of rapid rise, carefully curated power, an almost mythic aura of untouchability. But beneath the polished veneer, her record reveals something more troubling: contradictions, loaded tactics, and a judicial philosophy that too often functions less like interpretation and more like a weapon. Barrett's rise was meteoric. Born into a devout Catholic family in Louisiana, she was shaped early by a world that prized tradition, obedience, and faith as anchors above all. By the time she stepped into Notre Dame Law School, she was already marked by mentors as someone destined for the heights of conservative law. And indeed, she excelled, sharp, ambitious, and fiercely devoted to an ideology that read the Constitution less as a living guide for a changing people, and more as a frozen script locked in the 18th century. It was that philosophy, originalism, that became her calling card. To her supporters, originalism sounded principled, rigorous, even pure. But critics saw something else, a selective lens that too often conveniently aligned with the agendas of those in power. Under the guise of neutrality, Barrett's readings tilted toward restriction rather than expansion, toward consolidation rather than liberation. In practice, her ruling spoke to a worldview where rights could be rolled back but rarely expanded, where precedent mattered only if it reinforced the status quo. Her alignment with powerful backers cemented this trajectory. Conservative legal circles, spearheaded by the Federalist Society, had long been crafting a bench of judges who would lock in ideological victories for decades to come. Barrett wasn't just in their orbit, she was one of their stars. When Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death left a vacancy on the court in 2020, Barrett's name leapt to the top of the list, pushed by the same machine that had engineered the rise of justices before her. The timing was explosive. Just weeks before a presidential election, conservatives pushed through a confirmation in record time, ensuring their control of the court would remain unshaken. For Barrett, the robe came not with quiet reverence, but with a spotlight of controversy. Progressives saw the move as a theft of power, a manipulation of democratic norms. Conservatives hailed it as a triumph. Barrett herself smiled politely through the storm, insisting she was guided only by law and not by politics. But her record betrayed a different story. Take her questioning style. For instance, in oral arguments, she cultivated a sharp, almost surgical precision, cutting into lawyers with lines of inquiry that sounded less like neutral curiosity and more like loaded traps. Critics call them attacks wrapped as questions, designed not to probe but to corner. She would lean in with calm detachment, framing hypotheticals that carried within them the conclusion she wanted to reach. It was effective, yes, but it was also deeply revealing. For someone who claimed to be guided by textual fidelity, she often seemed to stretch her interpretations in ways that coincidentally aligned with the agendas of the right. Her contradictions became even clearer over time. Barrett spoke often of judicial humility, of not legislating from a bench. Yet she assigned onto decisions that reshaped American life in sweeping, deeply political ways. On reproductive rights, Her vote helped undo half a century of precedent in Roe v. Wade, a ruling that reshaped the lives of millions of women overnight. On voting rights, her record tilted toward restrictions, narrowing access rather than broadening it. On corporate power, she leaned predictably toward business interests, even as she insisted she was merely calling balls and strikes. And then there's the image she projected versus the power she wielded. Barrett often presented herself as modest, grounded, almost apolitical, a mother of 7, a former professor, someone who understood the weight of ordinary life. But that image, critics argue, masked a deeper arrogance. The belief that her interpretation of the law was singularly correct, that her brand of faith-informed originalism was beyond challenge. To her allies, this made her a heroine. To her detractors, it made her dangerous. In the chamber with Jasmine Crockett, that arrogance was on full display. Barrett's voice rose not just with the confidence of authority, but with the certainty of someone who believed she could not be challenged. It was not the first time. For years, Barrett had carried herself with the assurance that no one, certainly not a lower-ranking legislator, and certainly not a black woman, could puncture the armor she wore. She had been trained, reinforced, celebrated as untouchable. And that is precisely what made this clash so electrifying. Barrett did not see it coming, because she could not imagine it coming. She was a marble pillar, the untouchable conservative force, the justice cloaked in finality. But in that chamber, her sharp questioning, her reputation for intellectual ambushes, her contradictions, all of it crystallized into something else. The image of villain so accustomed to striking that she never considered what would happen if someone struck back. The truth is, Barrett's story is one of immense power wrapped in humility's disguise, a career built on the backs of movements that prize loyalty over independence, and a philosophy that elevated rigidity over empathy. And in this moment, across from Jasmine Crockett, it was no longer enough. Because when arrogance blinds you, you don't see the storm gathering until it's too late. To understand why this clash in the Supreme Court chamber felt so electric, you have to step back and see the path Jasmine Crockett walked to get here. Hers was not the smooth, gilded rise of a woman groomed by institutions and backed by billion-dollar networks. No. Her story was grit, fight, and the relentless push of a woman who had been underestimated too many times to count. Crockett was not born into halls of power. She was born into the struggles that so many Americans know too well. Raised in Texas, she came of age in a state that too often saw black voices as something to silence, women's voices as something to contain. But Crockett never learned to be small. She grew up seeing the way laws, policies, and prejudice could press down on everyday people. And instead of retreating, she built her life around a refusal to be quiet. Her entry into law was not about prestige. It was about protection. Crockett became a public defender, standing shoulder to shoulder with the people society cast aside. In crowded courtrooms, in late-night strategy sessions, she fought for clients who couldn't afford a lawyer, who couldn't navigate a justice system that seemed stacked against them. Every case, every cross-examination honed her skills. Listening closely, arguing sharply, cutting through the noise to the beating heart of justice. And she learned something else, too, that the Constitution, so often weaponized by the powerful, could be reclaimed by those it was meant to serve. Crockett's constitutional literacy became her blade, where others used legal jargon to intimidate. She used clarity to empower. She spoke about the law not as abstract principle, but as lived reality. Voting rights weren't words on parchment. They were the grandmother in her district who waited 6 hours in line because her polling place had been closed. Freedom of speech wasn't just theory. It was the activist silence by police at a protest. Equal protection wasn't hypothetical. It was a child denied a fair education because of the zip code they lived in. From the courts to the community, her reputation grew. Fearless, unapologetic, unwilling to bow. When she ran for office, it wasn't with the polish of a career politician, but with the fire of someone who had been in the trenches. Her campaign was fueled by grassroots energy, by people who saw in her a reflection of themselves. Overlooked, dismissed, but burning with potential. Against entrenched interests, she rose. And when she entered Congress, she carried with her not the air of entitlement, but the weight of responsibility. On Capitol Hill, she quickly earned a reputation. She was sharp in hearings, quick on her feet in debates, and unafraid to call out hypocrisy when she saw it. To some, that made her a target. To many more, it made her a beacon. She spoke the way people wish their representatives would speak. Plain, direct, cutting through spin with piercing clarity. And make no mistake, Crockett had already faced tougher rooms before stepping into the Supreme Court chamber. She had sparred with colleagues who underestimated her. She had endured sneers, interruptions, and the casual dismissals that so often greet women of color in power. She had faced the smirks of those who believed her presence was ornamental, not substantive. And each time, she answered not with anger but with precision. She turned underestimation into her weapon. When they thought she was too bold, she showed them she was too prepared. When they thought she was emotional, she showed them she was exacting. That was Jasmine Crockett's gift, the ability to channel what others saw as weakness into undeniable strength. Her debating skills weren't just sharp, they were surgical. She could dissect an opponent's argument piece by piece, until nothing remained but the hollow shell of their rhetoric. And she did it not with condescension, but with conviction that carried the weight of lived truth. She became known as a fearless truth-teller, someone who could stare down power and not flinch. And for her supporters, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, her voice was more than representation. It was validation. She embodied the fight they lived every day, the courage they longed to see reflected in leaders. But this moment with Barrett was different. The stakes here were higher than any committee hearing or floor debate. This was not simply about winning a point or landing a headline. This was about colliding with an institution that had, for centuries, been the final arbiter of rights and wrongs in America. And across from her sat a justice whose very presence on the bench symbolized how power could be consolidated by the few at the expense of the many. Yet Crockett was ready. Every courtroom where she had defended the voiceless, every hearing where she had cut through doublespeak, every fight where she had been underestimated, those were the bricks that built the foundation for this moment. She did not enter the chamber as an untested challenger. She entered as a woman forged in fire, sharpened by resistance, and armored by a history of standing tall when others wanted her to bow. As Barrett raised her voice, sharp and cutting, Crockett did not flinch. She had heard harsher tones in courthouse corridors, had faced down prosecutors determined to crush her clients, had stared into the eyes of systems built to break her people. This was not unfamiliar. The stakes were higher, yes, but so was the calling. What made this moment pulse with anticipation was the knowledge that Crockett's entire journey had been leading here. The girl who refused to be silenced, the lawyer who fought for the overlooked, the congresswoman who became a fearless voice. All of that lived in her still, waiting for this test. And though the chamber did not yet know it, her history had armed her with the tools she would need to turn this confrontation into something more than a clash. It would become a moment of destiny. Because Crockett knew what Barrett did not. You cannot shake someone who has already stood firm against storms far greater than a raised voice. And what she was about to say would not just echo in that chamber. It would reverberate across the nation. The first words out of Justice Barrett's mouth landed like strikes, crisp and deliberate, each designed to put Jasmine Crockett on the defensive. Barrett leaned forward, her tone sharpened, as if determined to rattle her opponent before the argument could even begin. "You've misunderstood the precedent," she cut in, before Crockett had completed her sentence. The chamber went still. Crockett had barely gotten through her first framing of the issue, when Barrett's interruption sliced across her words like a gavel. No one moved. Eyes darted from Barrett to Crockett, waiting for the inevitable clash. But Crockett didn't bite. She kept her tone measured, her body still, her gaze steady. She resumed, calmly restating her point. Barrett interrupted again. "That's not how the Constitution reads." A second blow, this one sharper, heavier, the kind of interjection that would have knocked a less seasoned debater off rhythm. Barrett was flexing her reputation. America's untouchable conservative force, known for her meticulous questioning, often leaving opponents scrambling for footing. And she seemed intent on making Crockett one more casualty. The interruptions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last. "You're conflating statutes with rights. That's not the question before us. Answer what I asked, not what you want to answer. By the fourth, fifth, Sixth interjection. Murmurs had started to ripple through the chamber. Observers glanced at one another, the imbalance in the exchange obvious. This wasn't a dialogue. It was an assault. And yet, Crockett remained composed. She did not raise her voice. She did not snap back. Instead, she let silence linger before she answered. Her pauses deliberate, her words measured. The quiet between Barrett's attacks and Crockett's responses grew longer, heavier, almost unbearable. The chamber could feel the tension thickening, like a storm cloud waiting to break. It was a strategy few noticed at first. Crockett was not just enduring Barrett's interruptions. She was absorbing them, letting the justice expend her energy. Every sharp interjection was met not with escalation but with patience, and that patience built suspense. By the ninth interruption, the press gallery was alive with scribbling pens. Headlines were already being written. Barrett batters Crockett. Justice pummels Congresswoman. But those who had watched Crockett before recognized something in her stillness. She was waiting. The imbalance was undeniable. On one side, a Supreme Court justice raising her voice, cutting her opponent off, pressing hard as at the end of the debate before it began. On the other, a Congresswoman sitting firmly in her chair, refusing to flinch, refusing to rise to the bait. Each new interruption tilted the room further. Barrett's authority seemed almost overwhelming. And yet, with each passing minute, the chamber itself began to sense a shift, not in what was said, but in what was unsaid. Crockett's restraint was not weakness. It was a gathering force. By the 12th interruption, some in the room were visibly uncomfortable. Barrett's insistence on dominance was beginning to feel less like rigorous debate and more like overreach. Even a few of her allies shifted in their seats, realizing the optics of Supreme Court justice repeatedly silencing a sitting member of Congress. Still, Crockett stayed steady. She leaned forward slightly, folded her hands, and when she spoke, it was in a tone so calm it forced the chamber to lean in. Every deliberate pause between Barrett's attacks and Crockett's responses drew the tension tighter. By the 15th interruption, the press gallery's tone had shifted. Reporters were no longer only tracking Barrett's blows. They were tracking Crockett's stillness, the way she absorbed each one and calmly built her case. Cameras zoomed in on her face, expression unshaken, eyes unflinching. The room was heavy now, not with noise, but with anticipation. Everyone could feel the imbalance. Barrett was swinging hard and often. Crockett was waiting, patient as stone. And deep down, the chamber began to realize what was happening. The justice was overextending herself. She was burning through her authority, while Crockett was quietly, methodically setting the stage. By the 18th interruption, the silence after Barrett's voice cracked like thunder. Crockett did not speak immediately. She let the chamber breathe in the weight of what had just happened. Another attempt to shut her down, another strike thrown from a bench, and then she raised her chin just slightly and prepared to answer. The air shifted. Everyone could feel it. The imbalance had reached its breaking point. Viewers leaned closer to their screens, sensing that Crockett was about to unleash the counterstrike she had been holding back. What came next would not just level the playing field. It would flip it entirely. For the 19th time, Justice Barrett interrupted. Her tone carried the same sharpened edge as the ones before, but this time the chamber noticed something new beneath the precision, a flicker of strain. Crockett didn't flinch. She sat back, waited for Barrett's words to hang heavy in the room, and then leaned forward just slightly, her hands folded with purpose. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady. Justice Barrett, she began. With all due respect, the Constitution does not bend itself to personal interpretation. It speaks for itself. The room froze. That single opening sentence, calm, composed, undeniable, landed like a weight across the chamber. Reporters in the gallery lifted their pens at once. Crockett let the silence linger. Then she continued, her tone still even, each word carrying the force of deliberate control. Article 1 vests legislative power in Congress. Article 2 vests executive power in the President. Article 3, your article, vests judicial power in the courts. Separation of powers, justice, not consolidation of one branch over another. Barrett blinked. For the first time, she did not immediately cut in. Crockett pressed forward. And yet, your framing assumes that judicial interpretation alone defines the boundaries of our democracy. That is not what the framers wrote. That is not what the amendments have affirmed. And that is not what the people consented to. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Barrett shifted in her chair, her lips tightening, her gaze narrowing. Crockett had landed her first blow. The Congresswoman leaned forward, voice still soft but now with unmistakable precision. You argued just moments ago that my reading misunderstands precedent. But precedent, Justice, is not scripture. Precedent can entrench injustice as easily as it can advance freedom. Dred Scott was precedent. Plessy was precedent. Korematsu was precedent. And each time, it was not the court alone that course corrected. It was the people, through Congress, through amendments, through movements that refused to be silenced. The silence in the chamber thickened. Barrett's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Crockett paused, let the silence expand, then delivered her next strike. So when you insist the Constitution is fixed in the image of one ideology, you deny the very evolution that has allowed this nation to survive. And when you cut me off from speaking, you don't silence me. You attempt to silence every community I represent. A gasp broke from the back rows. Barrett shifted again, but this time her interruption never came. Crockett pressed on. Her words were scalpel sharp, each one dismantling the architecture Barrett had built. You say I conflate statutes with rights. Yet the Constitution itself recognizes rights not enumerated. You say I misunderstand the question before us. But the real question is larger than the narrow frame you prefer. Do we, as a democracy, honor the voices of the governed, or do we allow unelected arbiters to narrow those voices to fit their comfort? The chamber held its breath. Crockett's control was absolute now. Barrett's interruptions, once forceful, dominating, had vanished, replaced by silence, by the weight of being cornered. And then came the moment that turned the tide. Crockett straightened in her chair, her eyes locking onto Barrett's. Her tone sharpened, but only slightly, enough for everyone to feel the shift. You have asked whether I understand the Constitution. Let me answer you plainly. I understand it not as an ivory tower text to be manipulated by the powerful, but as a living covenant with the people who bleed, labor, and sacrifice under its promise. And in this chamber, in this moment, I am its witness. The words landed like a hammer. Audible gasps rippled through the audience. Barrett's composure cracked. Her lips parted as if to respond, then closed again, her fingers tightening around the arm of her chair. Crockett allowed herself one final pause. Then she delivered the line that would ricochet across the nation, the line replayed in headlines and social feeds, in every political ad for months to come. Justice Barrett, the Constitution is not your gavel. It is our shield. The chamber erupted. The silence broke into a thunder of murmurs, gasps, and hurried scribbling from the press. Cameras zoomed in on Barrett's face, rattled, visibly shaken, her authority pierced in real time. Crockett remained still, her eyes steady, her breathing calm. She had not raised her voice. She had not shouted. She had simply spoken with the precision of law, the force of history, and the weight of millions behind her. The power dynamic had flipped in an instant. Barrett, once commanding the exchange with relentless interruptions, now sat silent, her authority undermined by the very text she had claimed to protect. Crockett, once cornered, now stood not literally but unmistakably as the voice of constitutional fidelity. And as the chamber reeled, one thought pressed into every mind, from the journalists scribbling furiously to the senators gripping their desks. They had just witnessed history. The cameras caught Barrett's eyes narrowing, her jaw tightening again, as though reaching for a retort. But the moment had passed. Crockett's words had already carved themselves into the record, into the bloodstream of the nation's discourse. In living rooms across America, viewers leaned closer to their screens, some stunned into silence, others breaking into cheers. On social feeds, clips were already being cut, captions already typed. The Constitution is not your gavel. It is our shield. And though the chamber buzzed, though the clash was far from finished, everyone understood what had just happened. The tide had turned. The aftermath was immediate and unstoppable. The moment the words left Jasmine Crockett's mouth, The chamber was no longer the solemn cathedral of law it had been seconds before. It transformed into something electric, alive, uncontrollable. Gasps echoed against the marble walls. A low rumble of chatter rolled through the gallery, and even the stoic clerks at the edges of the room broke their disciplined composure with wide-eyed glances. The Supreme Court had witnessed arguments that shifted history, but never had the balance of authority shifted so visibly, and never with such theatrical force. Reporters scrambled. Pens scratched furiously. Smartphones lit up with rapid-fire tweets, and the soft click-click-click of camera shutters multiplied as if history itself might vanish unless captured in every angle. By the time Crockett sat back in her chair, calm as though she hadn't just detonated the chamber with a single line, the first hashtags were already firing off across X, formerly Twitter hashtag Crockett versus Barrett, hashtag Constitutional Shield, and hashtag Mic Drop Moment. The social media explosion. Within minutes, the clip of Crockett locking eyes with Barrett and delivering the line, "Justice Barrett, the Constitution is not your gavel. It is our shield," had gone viral. One slow-motion replay, set to dramatic orchestral music, was posted by an independent journalist within 10 minutes of adjournment. It racked up 500,000 views in the first hour. TikTok creators wasted no time turning the clip into cinematic remixes. Fire animation sparking behind Crockett as she spoke. Barrett's expression freeze-framed into stunned silence. The moment was no longer confined to the chamber. It had become global currency, traded, memed, and immortalized. On Instagram, celebrities weighed in. Kerry Washington posted the clip with a single caption, "That's how you do it." LeBron James tweeted simply, "Go! Off! Queen!" Clapping hands, medium dark skin tone, hashtag Crockett versus Barrett. Even musicians chimed in. Lizzo uploaded a flute remix of the mic drop line, turning Crockett's words into a viral soundbite. The hashtag soared into trending charts within 30 minutes, leapfrogging over sports scores, celebrity scandals, and even international headlines. By evening, hashtag Crockett versus Barrett had become the #1 trending topic in the United States. Then globally, the newsroom frenzy. Cable news networks moved with whiplash speed. CNN cut into regular programming with a banner, "Supreme Court Showdown." Crockett's words reverberate. MSNBC looped the moment in slow motion, dissecting Barrett's visible discomfort frame by frame. Fox News took a different angle, accusing Crockett of grandstanding and undermining judicial dignity. But the replay of her line still ran repeatedly, and every repetition amplified her reach. Commentators across the spectrum agreed on one thing. They had just witnessed a seismic shift in how the public perceived the Supreme Court's untouchable aura. One MSNBC analyst called the moment that humbled the Supreme Court. A conservative pundit admitted, reluctantly, whether you agree with her or not, Congresswoman Crockett just outplayed a sitting justice on her own turf. That doesn't happen. Late-night host sees it instantly. Stephen Colbert showed the clip to roaring applause, quipping, "The Constitution may not be Barrett's gavel, but Crockett just turned it into a hammer." Jimmy Fallon ran a parody skit where a giant cartoon gavel bounced away every time Crockett repeated her line. Meme culture takes over. If Crockett's calm stare and pointed delivery became the heartbeat of political commentary, memes became its comic relief. A still image of Barrett's startled expression was overlaid with a caption, "When you realize you just got fact-checked on live history." Another popular meme replaced Crockett's mic drop line with everyday frustrations. "The Constitution is not your gavel. It is my PTO request form." Teenagers on TikTok lip-synced the exchange, layering it with everything from anime fight music to WWE sound effects. By midnight, the remix soundbite of Crockett's words, slowed down, echoing, thunderclap added, had become one of TikTok's most used audios of the week. The political ripple. Politicians could not ignore the wildfire. Progressive leaders hailed Crockett as a rising star. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "That's how you confront power. Brilliant, fearless, unforgettable." Meanwhile, conservative figures scrambled to defend Barrett. Ted Cruz called the moment a disrespectful circus, but even his tweet racked up more retweets mocking him than supporting. The White House press corps peppered the spokesperson with questions the next day. Had the president watched the clip? What did they think of Crockett's words? The spokesperson dodged artfully, but everyone knew the administration couldn't ignore the viral force. A cultural turning point. The cultural shockwaves went beyond politics. College students began printing Crockett's quote on T-shirts by the hundreds. Law professors revised lectures overnight to include the Crockett moment as a modern example of rhetorical strategy in high-stakes debates. Civil rights organizations seized a viral line for fundraising campaigns, arguing that Crockett had given voice to the people's constitutional struggle in real time. Even skeptics admitted that something profound had happened. A courtroom, typically guarded from spectacle, had been pierced by a line so powerful it escaped the marble walls and entered pop culture in a way few legal moments ever had. The chamber itself may have emptied hours earlier, but its echo was alive in every living room, phone screen, and news broadcast across the country. Crockett hadn't just spoken to Barrett. She had spoken to America. And America, judging by the speed and ferocity of its reaction, was listening. The showdown was no longer just a hearing. It was a cultural event, a viral milestone, a before and after moment in how power was challenged. The aftermath was not just immediate. It was uncontainable. When the dust settled, when the clips stopped looping in endless cycles and the memes lost their first spark of novelty, one truth remained unmistakable. Jasmine Crockett had reframed an attack into a lesson. What began as a test of her composure against relentless interruptions had transformed into something larger, something timeless. Crockett hadn't simply won a debate. She had illustrated that dignity beats arrogance, not only in the Supreme Court chamber, but anywhere power tries to crush voice, truth, or presence. Where Barrett's interruptions rang sharp and domineering, Crockett's steady calm cut deeper. Where Barrett attempted to own the space through force, Crockett claimed it with principle. And in that balance, the people watching saw themselves. Her words lingered. The Constitution belongs to the people, not to elites. It was a reminder that the nation's most sacred text was not a weapon to be wielded from the heights of authority, but a shield for those whose voices are too often dismissed. By saying it aloud, Crockett shifted the ground beneath the debate. No longer was it about one justice versus one congresswoman. It was about democracy versus entitlement, representation versus gatekeeping. The lesson resonated far beyond the chamber. Students replaying the clip felt permission to speak up in classrooms where they had once stayed silent. Activists heard affirmation that standing firm mattered even when the odds leaned heavily against them. Everyday citizens, those tired of feeling dwarfed by systems too complex and leaders too distant, saw dignity prove stronger than intimidation. What Crockett embodied wasn't performance. It was leadership in its purest form. The courage to stay rooted in principle when provoked, the discipline to respond with knowledge instead of fury, and the vision to remind everyone that power is not permanent, but truth is enduring. Leadership, she showed, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly, waits for its moment, and then speaks in a voice so clear it cannot be ignored. The moral was unmistakable. Justice is not secured through volume, arrogance, or the privilege of a seat on the highest bench. Justice is secure when ordinary people, teachers, workers, voters, neighbors, insist that their dignity matters. Crockett turned a clash of personalities into a universal story. Arrogance can dominate for a moment, but dignity, rooted in truth, will always outlast it. For viewers, it was not just empowering. It was clarifying. Democracy, after all, is not about elites commanding obedience from the public. It is about the public holding the powerful accountable, armed with nothing more than courage, knowledge, and conviction. As a final wave of reactions rolled in, one commentator summarized it best. Crockett reminded us that the Constitution isn't about who holds a gavel. It's about who holds a promise. That promise, bruised but unbroken, lived on in every person who replayed the clip and felt stronger, steadier, less alone. Her calm wasn't just strategy. It was leadership. And leadership, in that moment, became contagious. Just as Barrett attacked, she tried to dominate, to dismiss, to overwhelm. But when the moment came, it wasn't her voice that history remembered. It was Jasmine Crockett's calm, unshakable response, the one that shocked the Supreme Court and rippled far beyond its walls. This wasn't just a courtroom clash. It was a mirror held up to our democracy. What does power look like when it's stripped of entitlement? What does leadership look like when it rises from resilience, not rage? Crockett gave us that answer. And in doing so, she reminded us of something we too often forget. The strength of democracy is not measured by the loudest in the room, but by the ones who refuse to be silenced. Because this is bigger than Barrett versus Crockett. It's about what comes next. It's about whether we allow arrogance to write the rules, or whether dignity, truth, and accountability continue to guide the future. And here's where you come in. If this moment gave you chills, don't just watch it pass by. Share it. Talk about it. Spread the reminder that calm can defeat chaos, that integrity can cut sharper than interruptions, and that voices rooted in truth can shake even the highest seats of power. Subscribe here and be part of amplifying the voices that refuse to be silenced, the ones that speak for democracy, for justice, and for all of us who believe the Constitution belongs to the people. 18 interruptions, one calm response, and a nation reminded of who truly leads.